CultPunk is it was just an inspiration a few years ago because I was thinking about sort of equivalent scenes in science fiction and fantasy fandom. We have steampunk and solarpunk and
Cyberpunk.
cyberpunk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
And I started imagining what would an equivalent be for this notion of creative religion. And CultPunk just came to me, and I got all excited about it. I wrote up a manifesto and created a website because that's what you do, in the hopes that that might serve as a bit of a bat signal. So I'm over here, and it sort of has actually.
So I was just saying, like before we started recording, that I pulled a tarot card as maybe see if there's like a guiding image for our conversation, and I pulled the Fool card, which I think is totally perfect. Just going in, kind of no agenda, open, um, yeah, being led by spirit maybe or instinct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think that's an excellent way to start. And it struck me that if you'd pulled the death card, I would have fallen over where I'm sitting because the last time I drew a tarot card, I'm not especially into tarot myself or divination, but we were doing a ritual event about a month ago at a wonderful retreat center in Vermont, doing an appreciation circle, about 14 people sitting around in a large circle. And the task is each of us say what we appreciate and then what we fear about each of the people in turn. So it's an intense thing with 14 very highly articulate people. It took 3 hours or so. Um, and at the beginning, you draw a tarot card, but don't look at it. And my nephew, who was sitting next to me in the circle as it was about to be my turn to reveal my card, knew a bit about my interests in memento mori philosophy and joked, "Oh, you'll have drawn the death card." And sure enough, I drew the death card, which under those circumstances for me at that time, yeah, apparently I looked it up, there's a 1.21% chance of drawing any tarot card. But under those circumstances, it was mind blowing.
Hmm.
We can talk about exactly why later on.
Yeah. Well, just off the bat, I'm curious, as a self-professed atheist, what do you think about these kind of synchronicities?
I think they're cool when they happen. Um, I don't ascribe certainly any supernatural whys and wherefores to it. It was a profoundly meaningful coincidence for me at that moment. And it's being open to that sort of meaning, I think, that would be part of my definition of what I think of as soulfulness. I tend to prefer to think in terms of soulfulness than spirituality per se.
Yeah, me too. So we've got that in common, which is also a good starting point.
It is a good stuff.
Yeah. Well, I know you said in our email exchange that you're adverse to talking about yourself, like a lot of us Gen Xers.
Yeah.
But I think from what I can tell, what I've read so far, you've led a pretty interesting life, and I think you're an interesting guy. So I'd love to hear a little bit of background. Maybe starting by explaining this accent of yours, where you grew up.
Oh, I was born and raised in New Zealand, of all places. I now live in Chicago in the US, but yeah, born in New Zealand, Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. A long time ago now, I was born during the summer of love. Um, I am sort of, as a Generation X New Zealander, that is a kind of double layer of whammy about talking about myself too much, but I do have a sort of a précis origin story type thing, which I can get into now if that's useful.
Hmm.
All right, so born and raised in New Zealand in the late 60s, into a completely atheistic family. My parents had no interest at all in spirituality or religion of any kind. And people sometimes think I'm exaggerating when I say this, but literally no church, no Sunday school, no indoctrination of any kind at all. So I was tabula rasa.
Hmm.
I had a kind of a formative experience though when would have been about 10. And we were on a family vacation to San Francisco, which was a big deal in those days and would normally have been beyond our means. But my dad had come into a windfall and decided to blow the whole thing on a 6-week family vacation to California. Found myself standing in San Francisco outside the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum. which is this terrific tourist trap sort of a thing set up at Fisherman's Wharf. It's probably still there. And outside the, believe it or not, museum, they had set up a bed of nails on the sidewalk. Now, I had had this kind of unusual upbringing without any religion or spirituality, but with kind of a backstage understanding of how culture happens. My dad had been a radio DJ and a professional magician for a while when he was a teenager. He was an actor and director. And so I'd just grown up taking all of these things for granted. I knew how TV shows happen because I'd seen it happen. I'd been in the rehearsal studios. I knew how magic tricks worked because Dad had taught me and I'd read books. To say, I knew the trick for lying down on a bed of nails. And because I was 10, I was naive. I assumed the reason you have a bed of nails set up outside your museum, you believe it or not museum, is so that people can lie down on it and have pictures taken. So that's what I did. And the formative moment was, I remember this vividly to this day, as I was laying down and turning my head so that Dad could take his picture, and however many seconds that took, this crowd just materialized out of nowhere on the sidewalk. By the time my head's turned, there's a sea of American adults sort of gaping at me, going, "Oh my God, what's this kid doing? Oh my God." And I was very shy at that age, and I was really very embarrassed by the situation. I didn't want to be the center of attention that way. So Dad took his picture, and I sort of got up and scurried away. But the experience got me really interested in this matter of belief. Because as far as I was concerned, I was just following the instructions in some old Carney book that I happened to have read. As far as this instant crowd was concerned, somehow this random 10-year-old kid had just pulled off a feat of shamanic wonder. And I was pretty, at 10, I would probably have assumed that adults, American adults, would be these sophisticates who would understand this sort of thing basically by virtue of adulthood. The fact that they didn't struck a chord with me. And it sort of sparked this long-term interest in the phenomenon of belief, particularly why people believed in the supernatural, because I just didn't. I'd never seen any reason to. And that evolved through my teenage years. I would do a lot of readings, libraries, and secondhand bookstores. I was always more attracted to the fringy stuff, never especially interested in mainstream institutionalized religions. But I was interested in the variety and the color of fringe spiritualities. And that evolved as I became an older teenager. I started to go along and visit groups, visit their meetings and public lectures and so forth. Never really from the perspective of trying to find a new belief system for myself, because I was pretty happy with sort of rational humanism. But because I was interested in the people, I was interested in the phenomenon as a sort of from an anthropological point of view. And so I did that, developed a really strong interest in my late teens, early 20s, in the idea of creative spirituality. Excuse me. Which was the notion I came across in Margot Adler's wonderful book, Drawing Down the Moon, which is a very comprehensive survey of the American neo-pagan scene during the 70s. I would have come across it in the late 80s, I guess. And she's interviewing practicing pagans who say things like, well, no, to me, the gods are not literally supernatural entities. These are archetypes. These are poetic symbols for great forces of nature and for hidden potentialities within myself and within the people I love in my community. And I find that by engaging with them on an as-if basis, my life is better. And that struck a real chord with me. It's like, yeah, that makes sense. That way I can sort of access all of this mythopoetry and color and mystery and all the things that I was kind of missing in my daily life as a 20-year-old living in Wellington, New Zealand, without having to give away my sense of rationality and my sense of how the world actually worked. And so that was tremendously appealing. I developed a strong interest in a Japanese discipline called Shugendo, you may be familiar with. Basically a shamanic practice. Shugenja, who are effectively lay monks, will trek up into the mountains in Japan, go up particular sacred mountains along ancient ritual paths. And at various points, they will perform symbolic rituals at a particularly charismatic waterfall or a giant boulder or a great grand vista or something. They will perform symbolic rituals which are effectively tests of their balance and nerve and ingenuity sometimes, all done as a way to prepare their souls for the reality of death. And that was an idea that struck this massive chord with me. But up until I accessed this idea of creative spirituality, I had no way to sort of enter that idea. There was no one to initiate me because I was 20 and living in New Zealand. Having come across this creative spirituality notion, the idea that you can invent your own soulful practice in the same way that you might write a poem or compose a song or write a play or some such. That gave me this kind of artistic license, I felt. And I started to improvise and create my own, I called it berserker shugendo, on the beaches and the mountains around Wellington, New Zealand. And it was a very romantic period of my life. I would go running up through Mount Victoria, through the mountains of Mount Victoria at midnight, swinging sacred sledgehammers on the mountaintops, going on self-devised vision quests out along these wild stretches of beach, climbing cliffs to construct secret altars that only I would ever see. It was a very romantic period, and I needed that in my life at that time. And so that was just kind of what I did, but it was always on this really underground basis. There was no one in my life I felt I could discuss this with meaningfully. It was just this weird thing that I did. Now, in the midst of all of this, there was another formative moment, which is a much sadder one. My best friend in the world, a guy called Simon Kutavinas, really nice guy, was unfortunately in a horrific motorcycle accident. I got a phone call saying, "You've got to get to the hospital now." So I shot in there. And I went into Simon's room, and I still remember his face was so badly swollen that in the dim light, I could only just recognize him. And he was my best mate. But so I said what I felt that I was able to say. I said my goodbyes. I left the room, and about an hour later, he died. So I did the things that are culturally sanctioned under the circumstances. I attended his funeral, and I respected the ceremony, but it didn't move me. I received no sense of closure from that. I wrote an obituary for the newspaper on behalf of his friends, and I helped his family to clear out his belongings from his flat, his apartment. And the cultural implication is that that's basically it. You do these things and then you move on. And I suppose I could have, but to quote C.W. Nicol, my soul demanded a dramatic gesture. And so being as immersed I was in this practice of creative spirituality and sort of embodied soulfulness, I took it upon myself to create a memorial ritual in Simon's honor. And one night I went out to this wild beach, Breaker Bay Beach, where I'd actually taken him on a ritual excursion maybe a year before. And I took with me a wooden longbow and an arrow. And I wrapped the head of the arrow in like rags, dipped it in kerosene, set fire to the arrow, and again said what I felt needed to be said, and just shot this fiery arrow out into the ocean. And that, I felt, gave me the closure and the set, because I knew that Simon would be honored by the drama and the romance and the sort of both of us being 25 years old at that time. He would have felt good that I'd done that in his honor. And looking back well over 30 years later now, I'm so glad that I did that, because that gave me this sense of mythopoetic wholeness that I can now look back on in connection with his life and with the tragedy of his death. And that experience basically convinced me that I was onto something with this weird practice that I was developing. And long story short, I kept on doing that I'm still doing that today. It was always on a sort of underground basis. It had no real strong connection with what I did for a living. I wasn't really involved in social circles that were into this sort of stuff. So it just stayed my own underground thing right up until the time of the pandemic. And we had just been to New Zealand. We'd been over there on a family vacation, celebrate my mother's 80th birthday, which is this wonderful thing. A few days after that, we received the devastating news that my sister-in-law had died. She'd suffered a long illness and she died. She was in America, we were in New Zealand. There was nothing we could do about that other than cry. Maybe a week after that, still in New Zealand, but we start hearing reports about a novel coronavirus. We arrived back in the States. We had time for a sort of an ad hoc memorial ceremony for Rachel. And within, I guess, a month or two, the COVID lockdowns started. And this is, I guess, this is the third formative moment. The world is plunged into this existential crisis, and everybody listening to this will know what I'm talking about. At the beginning, when the lockdowns happened, none of us knew how bad this thing could be. This could have been the 1918 influenza pandemic all over again. It could have been the end of the world for all any of us knew. But I knew, because of the way I'd been thinking, following the sort of existentialist path for 35 years, that morale under these circumstances is really important. I started going for these long walks, long evening walks, walking often in the middle of the streets because there was no traffic, because there were no businesses open. And also, I had a bandana, which I wear sort of tied across my lower face as a makeshift mask, which made me look and feel like an outlaw ghost. Mm-hmm. So I'm just drifting through the streets of my Chicago neighborhood. Everything's abandoned, and you can feel the world changing around you under these circumstances. This one night, very warm spring night, I was walking along right beside Lake Michigan, and there was a low chain link fence separating the sidewalk from the lake. I was walking, believe it or not, to the local cemetery, and I saw a spot of color up ahead, and walked up to this thing, picked it up. It was a panel from a probably 1950s vintage horror comic book that someone had carefully cut out, pasted to cardboard, and inserted into the links of this chain link fence. And the image was of a skull-faced boxing referee raising the hand of a skull-faced boxer in victory. The caption reads, "The winner and still champion, death." I turned the card over. On the back, presumably the same unknown hand is written, "Live in fear, die anyway." And that was one of these duende moments, because I'd been telling people exactly that for 35 years. And the odd philosophical conversation that I'd get into. And the stuff I'd been developing for 35 years was an inoculation against that existential dread. And it was just like a thunderbolt. It was like, I found that card under those circumstances. I realized I have to make this public. It can't just be my own thing anymore, because people are suffering, people are dying, people are losing their loved ones. So with no illusions about this being the next big thing, it's only ever going to appeal to a tiny niche audience. But some of those people, I think this stuff can help them. And so I sort of wandered home in a daze trying to imagine what that might look like. And basically that's been the last 5 years of my life, not 4 years. That's kind of what brings me here, I think.
Yeah, yeah. What a great story, man. You're a really good storyteller.
Thank you. I take that skill seriously.
Yeah. So, what have you been doing to make a living in all this time? I think you've been involved in like theater and things like that, right?
Most of my career, yeah, was in the performing arts. For a long time, I worked first in New Zealand and then internationally as a stage combat and physical theater tutor. So that's teaching actors how to do all sorts of unusual physical skills, especially fights, sword fighting and unarmed combat and that sort of thing, creating the safe illusion of danger and violence. And I worked for a number of years as a stuntman. I was a professional wrestler for a few years, martial arts instructor, bodyguard on occasion. And yeah, that just became the basis of my career. And when I wasn't doing choreography and performance and that sort of thing, I would teach in the drama schools. Again, originally in New Zealand and then increasingly around the world. And for several years, that was my full-time. I spent 6 months out of any given year just traveling the world and teaching.
Hmm. How did you gain your reputation enough to get invited to go around the world?
It's a good question. I attended the first ever international stage combat gathering, which happened in London in 1995, I think. And at that time, again, living in New Zealand, and this is something it's worth pointing out for younger viewers and listeners. Before the internet happened, you might become interested in some obscure thing like existentialist philosophy or shugendo or stage combat or any one of these sort of fringy topics. Before the internet, you'd go to the local library. You would get the one book that they might have on something vaguely related, and that's it. And the rest of that is the information that's available. And so you just, if you're me, you just spend years sometimes wondering about things and sort of letting your imagination play with ideas because there was no further information. That seems so exotic now, so quaint when we can learn anything just by typing it into a search engine. But that was the reality of life back then. The way the stage combat thing worked was I decided that it was what I wanted to do for a living, building on a lifetime of interest in martial arts and performance and that sort of thing. It just seemed the natural fit. Without any mentors and with only access to one book, I had to develop my own system. And I had this inspiration when I was about 25 or so, that rather than sort of teaching actors tricks, this many number of sword thrusts and 8 ways to stage to fake a punch and that sort of thing, I could try to boil the performance skills of stage combat in the broadest sense down into a series of basic skills which could be taught through games and exercises. So the concept was that rather than you can spend your entire life learning new tricks, but if you have this underlying structure of understanding and being able to perform, eventually it became a set of 7 skills, then within your athletic capability, you'll be able to perform damn near anything that a choreographer throws at you. That became the basis of my teaching. And I did that for several years, went to London to attend the first ever international workshop, which was the first time I'd ever met other specialists in this weird area. And there were probably 150 people there. And as it turned out, my approach was very innovative. I hadn't actually known that at the time, but it was unusual enough that it attracted attention from a number of people who started saying, well, we want you to come over to Canada, to Japan, to different places to sort of teach this in a more concentrated way. And so I said, yes, yes, that'll be great.
Yeah. And people love systems and sets of principles, right? That's very attractive as like a new thing to kind of get into something or to frame something, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was just lucky, as it turned out, that it was a very unusual approach in that sphere, and people were intrigued, basically.
hmm Yeah, kind of innovating outside of on the edges of the group or the culture. Just kind of you're out in
Yeah,
the wilderness, kind of following your imagination and intuition and creating this system. And then
yes.
you go into the culture and they're like, oh my God, what's this new thing?
Yeah, and that was I got lucky. It was just circumstance. It was me being isolated at the bottom of the world in New Zealand, being so into the idea of doing this thing that I had no choice but to invent it myself.
Hmm.
And then just through luck, meeting other professionals, and it just turned out that it was something that intrigued them.
hmm And there's a strong parallel, obviously, to the idea of DIY religion and
Yeah,
this kind of artistic approach to spirituality.
yes, yeah, that was not lost on me. Yeah, um, yeah, it is, and I think it's partly a generational thing. It's partly the punk DIY ethos of Generation X, um, and it's just the way I intuitively do things. I have very little facility with numbers. and very little facility with sort of sequential processes. But I do have a bit of a knack for creativity, thinking outside the box. And I'm certainly at this point in my life, I'm closing in on 60, have a enough experience of and enough respect for that process, that sort of more intuitive process, that I'm very comfortable operating in that way.
Hmm. Yeah. And I mean, all of the traditions began with somebody innovating out of their own imagination and creativity and experimentation, right? And then at
Mm.
some point it gets systematized and dogmatized. But in the beginning, that's the genesis of any kind of art, whether it's a martial art or creative art, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I've sometimes recently been talking in terms of inventing punk rock, and the trick to do that is to invent punk rock without then becoming punk rock incorporated.
Hmm.
And that's going to be a really, really fine needle to thread, I think. But if it's up to me, then it's not going to become punk rock incorporated. At least not to the extent that it might easily, if we're not aware of that as a kind of a danger.
Mm. And I think what you're referring to is this kind of the cult punk scene that
Yeah.
you're seeding out in the world
Yes.
through your blog and other things, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Cult punk is it was just an inspiration a few years ago. Because I was thinking about sort of equivalent scenes in science fiction and fantasy fandom, where you have steampunk and solar punk and
Cyberpunk,
cyberpunk.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
Um, and I started imagining what would an equivalent be for this notion of creative religion. And cult punk just came to me, and I got all excited about it. I wrote up a manifesto and created a website because that's what you do. Um, in the hopes that that might serve as a bit of a bat signal. It's like, I'm over here. And it sort of has actually. But the cult punk is sort of a hypothetical street lingo version of what I normally think of in more, as it were, mature artistic terms as poetic faith. They're the same phenomenon, just one is more of a sort of a street, um,
Yeah,
a
one's
Gen
got that
X.
more Gen X flavor to
Yeah,
it.
yeah. It's
Yeah.
more of a punk Gen X flavor. Poetic faith, or poetic faiths, is an idea that I had. I was actually I, that just I came across it as inspiration, doing an interview about 10 years ago. And it occurred to me that you could describe neo-paganism as an eco-poetic faith. And the poetic faith part of that is a play on Samuel Coleridge's famous quote from 1817, I think, the Biographica Literaria, maybe, where he talks about conjuring for a moment the temporary suspension of disbelief that constitutes poetic faith. And I thought that was a very powerful idea. And all I really did was kind of capitalize the P and the F. So poesis is creativity, and faith, although it's usually understood as faith in the supernatural, doesn't have to be so if it's qualified by poetry, by artistry. If it's understood that the subject of faith is the sort of the object of art and vice versa, if we understand and acknowledge that we're making this stuff up, and we take that as license to take it really fucking seriously, then maybe we're onto something. And maybe this is a sort of a third way perspective and a third way praxis that's outside of the true believer perspective, and also outside of the type of skepticism that is satisfied with just saying no to everything.
Hmm.
Maybe this is a sort of a third way that might be useful in the future.
Oh, dude, I'm so with you. And yeah, finding your work has helped give me some language around
Mm.
ideas that I've been wrestling with. Like, I've been thinking about it in terms of like Ian McGilchrist's idea of the left and right hemispheres of the brain, the rational and the irrational. But the way I've been thinking about it is the modern mind and the mythic mind, and finding this third way of bridging both of those, allowing those both to coexist, and still finding a way forward into a meaningful, soulful life. and trying to find that balance. And some of my guiding lights have been like Carl Jung and James Hillman,
Of
and
course, yeah.
even Camille Paglia, who called
Mhm.
herself an atheist pagan.
Yeah.
And that's a term I've been kind of trying on for size recently.
Well, you and actually a lot of other people.
Hmm.
The anthology that I was talking about a bit earlier, the one I was interviewed for, where I came up with eco-poetic faith. That's an anthology called Godless Paganism, and it was, I can't actually remember, it was a number of years ago. Um, and it's an anthology, big, thick book of interviews with as it were, godless pagans, people who are um, delighted to take part in pagan ritual, and they appreciate the mythology and the story. They don't take gods and ghosts and magic literally, but they do take those things seriously
Hmm.
from this mythopoeic perspective. Um, and since that book was published, it's sort of a matter of a community gradually coming out of the broom closet. Because personally, I think that perspective has been present in that sphere, in the neo-pagan sphere. I know that it has since the late 60s. I think it was in a way more publicly, it was more acceptable to present that perspective publicly during the 70s. I think that this is just a theory. I haven't really looked into the history, not at an academic level, but my theory is that as paganism moved closer to or was sort of absorbed to some extent into the mainstream of the New Age movement, I think it became at least sort of déclassé for pagans to say, no, I don't literally believe in Odin. I don't literally believe in Isis as a supernatural figure, but I have such respect for them and such, I feel in my soul such resonance with what they represent at the psychological level, at the anthropological level, at the soul level. Yeah.
Hmm.
And this is speaking of soul as being a matter of what is felt, of what I think of as duendes, deep emotion. Yeah, unfortunately, I think during the 80s, that perspective just became submerged. And there was a sense that it was sort of rude to express that publicly. But it is coming back now, I think, particularly since the publication of Godless Paganism. Now you have atheopaganism and SAS witchcraft, they call it, skeptical, atheistic, and science-seeking witchcraft. So it's a
Doesn't roll off the
perspective.
tongue.
No, but it also this is early days for this stuff,
Hmm.
and it's very cutting edge. This perspective is cutting edge stuff. The Satanic Temple is a very good example of the same concept writ very large and made very political.
Yeah, yeah. Um, hmm. I think like I didn't know that about the neo-pagans, that a lot of them didn't profess like a literal belief. My perception from the outside was that these are kind of true believers who have just kind of regressed into a kind of a fantasy of pagan life and things like that. And maybe there's a mix of people in that broader camp, right?
Yeah, it's a spectrum, and I would say that also within an individual psyche, it's very easy for people to operate within a spectrum there as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess for me, like the neo-paganism, I just have been not only not attracted to, but kind of repelled by the aesthetics of it. And so when I'm finding like your work coming from this DIY punk rock aesthetic of Gen X, which I share as well, I'm like, oh yeah, this is the stuff, and like clear and simple and direct and forceful language as well. It's not all like airy-fairy Miss of Avalon kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah, or I mean, I don't know. I take a very, as it were, Catholic perspective on this phenomenon. I think I mentioned in the emails I'm currently editing what's going to turn into a 3-volume anthology of interviews with people who have founded their own. Sometimes I use the phrase embodied and aestheticized ritual practice, or embodied and aestheticized, excuse me, embodied and aestheticized philosophy.
Mhm.
It's hard to say, but yeah, I've tracked down, well, now 16 people who have been doing that sort of work intensively for a number of years, some of them for a couple of decades. Um, And they come at it from all sorts of angles and with all sorts of aesthetics, all sorts of different takes on the subject. But basically, they're all approaching it from the same perspective and they're all moving in the same direction. My big interest is, I was talking before about developing this thing as a scene equivalent to punk rock. And in that case, the individual cult punk groups or individuals or individual poetic faiths, and these range from tiny little activities that are really only practiced by small groups of people, sometimes only one person. It's their own thing, as my one was for a long time, up to events that, ritual events that sort of encompass an entire city. And then through to things like the Satanic Temple, where they have somewhere north, I think, of 1 million members now. So from that point of view, I take a very broad, I'm broadly accepting of aesthetics and points of difference because I find the whole phenomenon fascinating.
Yeah, like just like within the punk scene, there are so many different expressions or people that were labeled as punk. Like, there's a huge difference between a band like Television and the Sex Pistols, but both are kind of considered punk because they shared a common ethos, I think, and approach and aesthetic in a way. Um, so yeah, I get it. I like that too. It's like allow for all different kinds of expressions, um, but sharing a common ethos. Yeah, that works for
Yeah,
me.
and moving in the same direction, I think. People
Hmm.
sometimes frame the metamodern religion or metamodern spirituality discussion in sort of monistic terms, as what will be the new religion of the 21st
Right.
century.
Yeah.
And that's all of that suggests to me there's upward movement towards a single point. And I,
Hmm.
with the greatest respect to everyone involved, my preference would be sort of the opposite of that. It would be something more like a fungal mycelial network of an underground scene that just spreads in all sorts of interesting directions.
Hmm. And everywhere it kind of fruits up, the body of it looks different.
Yeah,
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 based on the environment and conditions and all that, just like a
precisely
mushroom.
so. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And some of them inevitably will die off, and others will flourish and propagate. And that I prefer that model. I think just intuitively.
Yeah.
So that would be my ideal. It would be a scene of about 1 million wildly different subcults, all moving in broadly the same direction.
Yeah. But yeah, it's nice to have something that brings all those disparate people together because I feel like I've been
Mm.
developing my own little thing up here, wrestling with some of these ideas, trying out different practices in my community, experimenting, but then like wanting to kind of hash this stuff out, bounce off ideas or off others, and looking
Yeah, yeah,
around and going, like there's people who are into the kind of post-Jungian archetypal psychology of like James Hillman and people like that, or Thomas More, who wrote a book called The Religion of One's Own. But it's for me, it's always been really light on community and also on praxis. And
yeah.
first and foremost, I'm a practitioner. Like I'm an experimenter. I have to
Me
do
too.
things to see if it creates an effect, and the kind of effect that I'm looking for, something transformational or transcendent or meaningful at least.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same way. And honestly, that's why I decided to frame this. Well, it's turned into a trilogy of an anthological trilogy, I guess, as a series of interviews with practitioners, rather than me writing some quasi-academic analysis of the whole scene, which I'm probably barely qualified to do anyway. No, I want to go to the individuals and say, okay, tell me about what you do.
Hmm.
Um, and we've got 16 interviews now. There may be another several to come. And I'm hoping that the publication of these 3 books, which will be over roughly the next year, may serve as a bit of a genesis towards the community that I think you and I are both interested in. Because my observation has been that most of these people are in the same position, that they're operating as individuals, as small groups, on local levels. Some people, some certainly have pretty active online presences as well. But so far, there hasn't been a great deal of crossover. Um, People are not necessarily aware that this is a scene because really it isn't yet. It's a nascent scene at best.
Hmm.
but I do think it has enormous potential.
Hmm. Yeah, well, it always takes someone to identify a burgeoning scene and then to make something that kind of documents the formation of that scene, And so this kind of idea of like an oral history of this burgeoning scene
Yeah,
seems like the right move rather than to jump ahead to, like you said, some kind of scholarly analysis of this thing, and to kind of maybe claim it, yourself as the expert on the scene or something, but to be
yeah.
a documentarian of the scene.
That's exactly that. That has been the motivation. And funny that you say documentarian, because it occurred to me about three-quarters of the way through that this would actually make a terrific subject for a documentary.
Oh yeah. Yeah, to
Um,
see some of this stuff in action would be
yeah,
really great.
yeah, it's very visual, and it's I may well see if I can do it. I've actually co-produced and directed a couple of little indie documentaries over the years. Um, this one, I would like it to happen. Things that I want to happen in the world fairly often do one way or the other.
Hmm.
So, but we'll see. But at the moment, we're definitely focused on the anthology and sort of using that to develop the thing that may develop into the community.
Hmm. And are you thinking about like right now, CultPunk is a blog where you're just kind of collecting stuff, putting it out there, things that seem kind of in line with what you're thinking about. But are you thinking maybe an online community of some sort would be a great way to get people together?
Yeah, it would be. I'm not the greatest community builder in the world,
Mhm.
but I'm hoping to attract collaborators who are. Um, yes, yeah, that would be ideal.
Mhm. I noticed on the blog recently you posted a video by Aubrey Marcus, and you posted it without comment. And I'm curious, like, I've got my feelings about his whole life coaching empire and him as the kind of head of that. I'm curious, like, what you think about it and why you posted that.
I posted it because, yeah, that was recent. Um, I watched the full documentary. I had never encountered Aubrey Marcus before.
Ah,
I
okay.
had no concept of what his background may be. I've looked into a little bit since I saw it. Um, it touched on enough themes that are relevant to the rest of the blog that I thought it would at least be of interest to people.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, I just think like calling it a documentary is a bit disingenuous because he produced it himself and he's done a number of these things that feel more to me like self-mythologizing and
Mm.
even like infomercials for his coaching program that costs thousands of dollars and is kind of set up like a multi-level marketing scheme.
Yeah, I saw a bit about that, but no, I'm happy for it to stay on the site because taking that, I mean, obviously it's a very slick production. Yes, it does have an infomercial quality, but if you read Jamie Wheel's book, Recapture the Rapture,
Yeah, I'm familiar with this work. Yeah.
um, he writes about, apart from anything else, the processes that he identified in terms of praxis, things like breath control and use of substances and use of somatic movement exercises and so forth. Um, all of those, I would say, yes, all of those work. That's not controversial. There are excellent examples of that process in the what's it called? The anti-cult is the name of the thing, the video.
Yeah, his program's called Fit for Service.
Yeah, and I think the documentary was called Anti-Cult Healing in a Mad World, something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and I thought that there was enough demonstration of how these things can, how these various things that Jamie Wheel, among many others, have identified as being useful sort of psychokinetic activators,
Hmm.
um, that it would be worth seeing.
Hmm. Yeah.
I'm trusting that my blog readers are sophisticated enough to be able to say, okay, this is kind of an ad, um, but it was a well produced example of a number of the way a number of these technologies work.
Hmm.
That was the
Yeah.
thought.
Yeah, I guess I was asking because you were talking about like inventing punk, not punk incorporated, right? And so a lot of these entrepreneurial types have taken Jamie Wheel's blueprint for a kind of secular self-development or spiritual praxis and turned it into big business.
I was not aware of that. Like I say, I wasn't actually aware of who Aubrey Marcus was until that video popped up. But it doesn't surprise me. I know that there was a guy. I mean, there's the whole New Age. They'd be called influencers these days, but New Age motivational speakers, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I know there have been some disasters in that sphere recently. There was the guy who I think people
Seal.
actually died doing his sweat lodge.
Oh yeah, yeah. Hmm.
And there are people being injured doing fireworks and all that sort of thing. Yeah, so there are massive, massive risks.
Hmm. Yeah, so I mean, this is something that I've always struggled with because that's a really ingrained part of my ethics as well, is like kind of non-hierarchical, anti-capitalist, democratic dissemination of ideas and praxis that actually work, you know? Like from the time I started teaching yoga until now, that's really been guiding me, and it's always been a struggle. Like, you got to make a living and all of that, and you want your work to be disseminated, but how to avoid kind of selling out, taking advantage of people, utilizing celebrity to become a
Yep.
kind of a guru and all of that shit. Like,
Yeah.
how do you keep it in check, going forward with this whole poetic faith punk cult movement? Well, not a movement, but scene, let's say.
It's a scene. Yeah. I don't know. I don't think there's any danger of me becoming a guru because I would either run from or possibly punch anyone who tried to treat me as a guru. Um, I don't know. I mean, and we should differentiate as well between poetic faith and cult punk, which is my interest on this side, and my own practice, which
Oh
I
yeah.
think of as the mysterium on the other. There's more sort of cultic danger in that. Um, I'm doing an event in late August in Vermont, which will be the first, won't actually be the first, but it will be the most intensive um, exposure of my philosophy and my practice and art and so on that I have done since around about the year 2000.
Hmm.
Around about 2000, I devised and directed a number of fairly large scale public ritual performance events revolving around my personal philosophy, which can be defined as or described as memento mori ergo carpe diem, remember death and therefore seize the day. That's my positive existentialism. That was the insight that I had way back when, before Simon died. It was certainly cemented during that period. And that is the thing that really animates my life. So if I have a teaching, that's it.
Hmm.
And that's the thing that I've been developing up to this point. Cult punk and poetic faith, they're sort of sociological fascinations. They're things that I think can be of value to the world. I'm keen to be able to sort of expose that idea and get people talking about it and so forth. The mysterium is my own practice. Of the two, I'd say, yeah, there's more danger. There's more sort of cultic danger in that one. But like I say, I did an event recently at the same venue, the Sky Meadow Retreat Center in Vermont, where I was introduced a couple of times in public discussions as sort of as an elder, or at once memorably as a religious leader. And I was like, no, 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 no. That is not what I am at all. I'll own elder, somewhere around 60 years old. And okay, if people want to treat me as an elder, that's probably okay. But I'm not a religious leader. I have no ambition to start a cult. But you're right. It's tricky because the weight of pop culture dating back to the 60s and really back to the 1920s, if you look hard enough, suggests that if you're gathering a group of people together and doing all this weird stuff with symbolism and art and drumming and so forth, of course everybody's going to say cult straight away. And I don't know, I'll let you know after we've done this event, I guess, how well I've managed to fend off the guru thing.
Hmm.
I think I'm going to do it pretty well.
I don't have any problem with cults. I think cults can be good. Like cult for me is short for culture.
Yes, yeah. Now that's the point. I'm speaking of cult the way that most people hear the word, due
Yeah,
to the 40, 60, however many years of pop culture exposure. But yeah, no, cult is short for culture, and I have great respect for subculture and for counterculture in particular.
yeah. Hmm.
So, like among us, I think that we could both, Jamie Wheel talks about ethical cults. Um, I speak about the, the potentials of a scene of a million different subcults,
Hmm.
all moving in broadly the same sort of cultural direction. Um, I between us, I have no problem with the idea of cult in the sort of the academic sense, but I'm aware that most people hearing the word cult think the Manson family, they think Jim Jones, they think Scientology, they think this.
Hmm. Yeah. But also it's kind of like keeping in the Gen X spirit, right? To kind of embrace that problematic term and use it I don't know, not even like in an ironic way, but in a kind of transgressive way or something.
Yeah, well, hence CultPunk. Yeah, that was the whole
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah. I
Yeah,
dig it.
I chose that phrase specifically because I knew it was going to sort of excite the right people and piss off and frighten the right people.
That's right. It acts as a kind of like a natural filter system.
Yeah,
Like if you're really
that's the
triggered by the
theory.
idea
This
of
is
cults, it's probably not for you because this is like experimental. There's a lot of play involved.
That's the
Um,
punk aspect. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, very cool. Um, I don't know, like I love the manifesto that you wrote up. I read it to my wife just before we had lunch today, and she was just like, "Yep, yep, yep. Like this is what we've been moving toward. This is yep, totally. This is."
Oh,
Um,
wow. Thank you.
yeah. And I wonder, like, do you want to go through it? Would that be too like kind of pedantic, or I think it'd be fun for
Uh,
listeners maybe to get a sense of it.
I guess
Maybe I could.
I've only ever done that once before, and that was recently. That was at this last event at the Sky Meadow in Vermont, the retreat center. That was the first time I'd ever read it in public.
Mhm.
So if I do that now, that'll be the second time I've ever read it in public.
Yeah, I don't know. Or maybe I could just post it if that feels better for you. I don't know. It's good, but it's kind of long. I was just gonna pull out like a couple different things and have you comment on them. A
That
couple
would,
different
yeah, that,
passages.
yeah. I think I'd probably prefer not to try and sort of read the whole thing as a performance now. But yeah, if you wanted me to comment, that's cool.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think the opening paragraph says a lot. We affirm that belief systems, rituals, symbols, pilgrimages, tenets, holy days, shrines, festivals, taboos, mythologies, and pantheons can and should be created as works of art. Now, it's those last few words that I think put a really interesting spin on it all, right? So talk about that a
Yes.
bit. Like
Yeah. Well,
DIY
that.
religion as like art.
Yeah, as art specifically. And that's the poesis, that's the poetic in poetic faith, that's the process of artistic creation. And it's the punk part of cult punk. And it offers people, I think, a license because very little of what we're talking about is dogmatic. Um, one of my colleagues, one of the interview subjects in the book, I should say, M. Dudek, excellent professional artist, Canadian originally, but he's based in Italy, travels around the world creating these incredible art exhibitions, often in galleries, sometimes in less traditional spaces, churches and that sort of thing. And it's all in service of this thing he calls the religion virus, which is an incredibly elaborate, purely science fictional mythology that he's been evolving for years and years and years. And all of his art is sort of explaining, and again from an almost anthropological level of detail, the deities and the mythology and the artifacts and the music and the art and so forth of this fictional religion. Um, and what he and I both, I think, have realized is that if you create a an immersive experience like that, to use a phrase that's currently buzzy in theatre. You create an immersive experience. You're inviting people to participate in it on the understanding that this is art. So you're not trying to impose an orthodoxy upon them. You're not trying to say, certainly not trying to get them to believe in something that offends their sense of intellectual integrity. But you're saying, this is deep play. Come play with us. And we think you're going to learn some cool shit. Or we think you're going to have some cool experiences.
Right, yeah, or feel some cool shit.
Yeah, yeah. And that tends to be the sort of the animating force behind a lot of the poetic faiths that I've been interviewing people about. It's the idea that you represent this very exotic, very unusual stuff as art, which is what it literally is, because this is the process of invention. Now, yes, all religions are, as far as I'm concerned, invented, but some inventions are worth taking really fucking seriously. Yeah, some myths are worth taking very seriously. I sometimes use the image of the Statue of Liberty to explain this to people who struggle with the concept. No one believes that Lady Liberty is a literally supernatural goddess of freedom. We understand this is a poetic construct. This is an artistic representation of an ideal. But because we take the ideal seriously, then people go to New York. I've been to New York a number of times, and I always feel good when I see that statue towering up over the harbor, because I know that it represents something that I take really seriously, the idea of freedom, the idea of, and that wonderful poem about, give us your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. That's beautiful, moving stuff. I'd say America needs that now probably more than ever. So it's a matter, the poetic faith is a matter of having faith in the real thing and taking the poetry seriously enough that it allows you to suspend that disbelief and really enter into the spirit of whatever the real thing is.
Mm-hmm.
The Statue of Liberty, it's the ideals of freedom. In my thing, it's the concept of remembering death and seizing the day, remembering that you are mortal and using that as fuel to fire your priorities in life and the choices that you make. Mm-hmm. For M. Dudek, it's this extraordinary fantasy world that he's creating and inviting people to inhabit, and then they learn all sorts of things through that, through their suspension of disbelief in his poetic fiction. Yeah, that's the animating concept. That's what sort of gets my juices flowing.
Yeah, that's great and very well articulated. That idea, it's such an important leap, I think, for people to take, like that you can take the thing that the symbol represents deadly serious, but don't get stuck at the level of the symbol. Like that's a kind of form of idolatry, or it's getting caught by literalism, right? And if you don't take the symbol itself as literally true, but see it as a representation of a literal truth, some force of nature or ideal, Platonic ideal or whatever, then you can work with it and play with it, and that's gonna serve you, and you don't have to throw out your intellect in order to go there. Yeah. No, I think it's exactly what we need now, you know? People are starved for meaning, but a lot of these people talking about the meaning crisis are so caught up in like rational materialism. And it's like, no, no, you don't have to throw that away, but just open your imagination and use these symbols to I mean, because we're relational beings, right? Without that representation, we can't really engage with the abstract ideal, or the kind of like ineffable force of nature that the thing is meant to represent. And so I see that as the kind of the genius of the pagan polytheistic religions, is that they came up with this riotous multitude of mythologies and deities, so that we can engage with the great mystery.
Yeah, yeah. And it's the idea that you can take that seriously, because the great dichotomy has been versus sort of literalism versus skepticism. True believer versus rock-ribbed rationalist skeptic. And there is this third way.
Hmm.
which is not intuitively obvious to either. In fact, would many people on both of those extremes, I think, would intuitively shy away from this concept. But for those who can grasp it, the third way perspective is that it is possible to take something not literally but seriously,
Hmm.
but very, very seriously.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, and I love this. This to me is so 90s. This second paragraph about says, surely any sufficiently advanced magic is indistinguishable from technology, and religions may usefully be considered as psychological technologies. Just like any other tech, they can be hacked or invented by those artistic fringe dwellers who have the courage, imagination, and tools to take that understanding and then ask, now what? Yeah, like, yeah, what can we do with this? I'm reminded of the work of Antero Ali. You must know him. He was a theater guy and kind of spiritual renegade.
I think so. Did he ever write a book on tarot or
Yeah, Antero, but also a book that speaks directly to this, came out of the 90s in the Hakim Bey kind of tradition. He wrote a book called Angel Tech, and it was all about kind of
yeah, I
being
think
a kind
I
of a
would probably have,
modern hacker
yeah,
of spiritual
yeah,
technologies.
yeah. I would have read that back in the day. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's great. And so it's s- yeah, seeing religions as a psychological technology. I've always felt that way too, like the technologies of yoga and shamanism, they're technologies that can be adapted to your time and your cultural circumstance. Like if you get down to their essence, like you're talking about with Jamie Wheels identifying these things. That's what we're talking about. How do we change our state of mind to open to this third way? How do we get out of the literal mind and get into the more intuitive mind and all of that through like something like breath work or dance and movement and chanting, music, obviously, all of that, entheogens.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then but I think like what is kind of missing, and maybe that's a good thing, is the kind of the framework. So is there a danger to just using these spiritual technologies in a free form artistic way? Have you come across any kind of pitfalls?
Not yet, not in my own practice, but like I say, this is all very new. I mean, when I found the card, I was talking before, I found the Live in Fear Die Anyway card. That was a turning point for me. That's what I think of within my own mythopoeia as a duende moment. Um, since then, a lot of my efforts in this area have been devoted to sort of talking about and teaching classes for that matter. I teach a course through the Joanna Ebenstein's Morbid Anatomy organization. Um, I've taught a class called The Art of Ritual, where I'm not speaking specifically about my stuff, but talking about the many ways that people have innovated in the sphere of memorial and memento mori ritual, paying some attention to the way those things are done in the as it were the revealed religions, but focusing much more on the countercultural and subcultural manifestations of innovation in those spheres. Um, but that it's always been sort of piecemealed out. We did a fairly serious symbolic ritual event that's more specific to the memento mori philosophy in Brooklyn, New York, late last year. And this upcoming event at Sky Meadow will, like I said, will be the first time that I have worked with a group of people on a sort of intensive week-long basis on some of these things that I've been doing myself over the past 35 years. So for me, it's a bit early to say. I can't really answer the question that you asked. Um, we could trade stories about, disasters that have happened when this sort of psychotechnology is misapplied.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, or experimented without any kind of guardrails or with like a kind of a strong enough ego or I mean, there's so many things that can go wrong and there's so many reasons for that. It's hard to guard against everything, but like at the end of the manifesto, you say like, let the seeker beware. I think that that's kind of like the excitement of it to me too, is that like it is kind of uncharted territory when you're DIYing your own spirituality and
Hmm.
praxis. Um, you got to go into something deeply, and if you go into something deeply, you don't know. Like if it is truly transformative, it could also like kind of wreak havoc on your life. And like what I tell people when I really start teaching them like a real yoga practice that actually worked, I'd say, you know, like be aware that yoga can ruin your life. And then I'd follow that up with, but some lives need a good ruining every now and again. Like,
Yeah. Now, okay. Since you said that, I was just very recently interviewing Benjamin Wax, who wrote a wonderful book on psychomagic.
hmm,
Um, and he was just saying that when he's occasionally talked with his colleagues in that sphere about putting together a society akin to what we were talking about earlier, sort of a practitioners guild of some sort. And they've joked about calling it the Life Ruiners Guild.
yeah.
I think
I
that's
mean,
very apt.
dude, at like 35, my life needed a good ruining at that point
Mm.
so that I could remake it in a more kind of creative, generative, authentic way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and
Practitioners
you
Guild. I like that. I'm footnoting that because it's a good way to talk about it. Practitioners Guild.
well, the Life Ruiners Guild was there. Um, they were kidding, I think, but yeah, it's an observation of an actual thing that can happen. Yeah, I don't know. I will do my best not to ruin anybody's life. I'm very interested in doing this on an altruistic basis. The event we have coming up is completely free, for example.
Yeah, I
Um,
noticed that, and
yeah,
I thought that was great.
yeah. Um, because as far as I'm concerned, like I should talk a bit about Sky Meadow at least, which is this institution. It's been a sort of an artist retreat and a yoga retreat sort of thing, way up in the Northeast Kingdom, they call it, in Vermont. Beautiful mountains and forests.
Hmm.
Since the 1980s, there's been this retreat there called Sky Meadow. We went there last year, my wife Kat and I, and just had a great time doing their harvest event, which is a free work stay. You you go up, you get free accommodation in one of these really charming little cabins, sort of tucked into the woods. You spend about 4 or 5 hours a day doing very wholesome work, you know, carrying wood for stacking in the woodshed, and pulling up carrots and potatoes and stuff, and picking apples.
Chopping wood, carrying water. Perfect.
Yes,
Right?
exactly. Yeah, and everyone who's there. This is the wonderful thing about that place. Everyone who was there was some species of genius. Um, and they were all, as it happened, the people who were there that time, all very into metamodern spirituality. And so the conversations that you're having while you're doing these sort of mundane tasks, I mean, it's enjoyable, wholesome work, but it's not small talk. I mean, you're talking about the future of AI, and you're talking about the 1960s and 70s counterculture scene, and about the caliber and heroes, people who've influenced you throughout your life. The caliber of conversation and the field of conversation was wonderful.
No dull small talk.
No, and so it occurred to me, we went into that and had a great time. Just recently, we went back and did a more sort of intensive formal retreat event, which had a more of a ritual focus. Got back from that, and it occurred to me that we could combine kind of the best of both worlds at this event that we've chosen to call the Mystery School. So the premise is that people will go there, um, do their 4 hours of farm work. They'll be staying in one of the quaint little cottages. There are forests to explore. There's a wonderful sauna next to a plunge pond for saunas, and it's almost like a sweat lodge type vibe if you do it right. Um, and then all the time that they're not doing the farm tasks, there are craft activities and there are ritual activities, and these will be the opportunities to have these deep conversations, to engage in ritual storytelling, um, symbolic ritual expeditions, that sort of thing. So all of the things that I've been doing for years and years, but this will be the opportunity for them for me to basically see how it works when I'm introducing it to a group of people.
Hmm.
All of it is for free out of sheer goddamn altruism. At this stage, my wife keeps saying, start the cult, start the cult. I'm making eye contact with her as we speak.
Is she nodding furiously? Like, come on,
Yes, she
man.
is. Yeah. But no, at this stage, it's all for free. It's all done out of altruism. It's an experiment. If it works as well as we hope it will, then maybe it can become something of a movable feast. Maybe it will form a template that can turn into something else, something bigger. I don't know.
Hmm.
But for this first one anyway, it's a countercultural experiment.
Yeah,
And I hope the best sense.
yeah. Well, I saw the retreat and I was like, these are my kind of people. This is my kind
Yeah,
of event. How do I get there? And now I'm on the far west coast of Canada. I lived for a time in Montreal, so I could have just driven down to
yeah.
upper Vermont there. But yeah, I looked at flights and it's madness. It would take me like 24 hours to fly there, hop, skipping and jumping around. So maybe we'll have to get you guys out to the beautiful West Coast sometime. There's far less black flies and mosquitoes out here.
Yeah, I do know. We were with this last event. We were fending off black flies with karate.
It's brutal, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll have to get you out west sometime.
Well, okay then. That might be fun.
Yeah.
I
Um,
mean, wait until we've done this one because it may all crash and burn. It may be a disaster. I
Yeah,
don't think it will.
I just wonder if some of like the West Coast people out here, they can be very kind of like earnest and sincere about their spirituality. I'm a bit of an outlier because I'm originally from more of the East Coast and from that Gen X era. Uh, so I haven't quite found my tribe of spiritual misfits out here yet. Um, they all tend to congregate on the West Coast around the Bay Area.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I don't know. It's the beginning of an adventure as far as I'm concerned. I do think that when what we're talking about is represented as philosophy and as art, which is what it in fact is, that takes some of the pressure off because, like I said before, you're not trying to impose an orthodoxy on anybody. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, and I'll know this better after this upcoming week, really, but regardless of what, for example, anyone may believe about the afterlife, whether there is a literal supernatural afterlife, I think that, and I don't believe in that, but I think that regardless of that belief or disbelief, pretty much anyone will be able to get a good deal out of the sort of things that I practice and teach. Because I think anyone can agree that even if after you die you believe that you go up to heaven or you believe that you're reincarnated as another being, whatever, the span of life that you had with all of its joys and sufferings and setbacks and great triumphs and boredom and everything else, everything that's gone to your life, that is in fact over when you die. And that understanding, I think, can animate pretty much any endeavor. Because when you really understand that what you have now is finite, then that informs your priorities, it informs your perspectives.
Hmm.
It means that you're way less likely to get distracted by bullshit.
Hmm. Yeah, and like, even if you believe in an afterlife and that the way that you live your life dictates the quality of your afterlife, um, that's up for grabs. We don't know. But what we do know is that the way you live your life will dictate the quality of your death and your dying. That is, there's no argument with that, I think, by this point. Just read any of those books, about people's last words, what they say on their deathbed. It was
I
all
see what you
about,
mean. Yeah, yeah.
regret over not having lived their life more fully or whatever. But so it's like that African proverb, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it goes like, when death finds you, may he find you still alive.
Yeah.
You know
Yeah,
what I
that's
mean?
very apt. Yes. Yeah. And so on that basis, sorry, to take it back to where we were before,
Hmm.
I think that um, if it is represented as art, kind of regardless of where you are, and bearing in mind that all of this is an incredibly fringe, esoteric sphere of understanding, sphere of knowledge. I think that if you're representing what you're doing as philosophy and art and as practice and as a sort of a creative experience that people can come in and immerse themselves in without imposing dogma, and certainly without imposing sort of supernaturalist dogma, then I think that's probably about as open a field as reliable to get.
Hmm. Yeah, and then within that, you can come in as a longtime practitioner to act as facilitator for those who
Mm.
are like new to exploring this, creative spirituality, to use that term.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that'll be the ideal. Maybe one day there will be a whole circuit of these things and people will go to Vermont to do the death stuff, and they'll go to this city to do the tree stuff, or this part of the world to do the tree stuff, and over here to do the sex stuff, and over here to do, you see what I mean?
Hmm. Yeah.
Maybe that'll be the nature of the scene,
Yeah.
but it's early days.
Yeah. When I've poked my head into this metamodern, was it metamodern spirituality?
Yeah,
Into that little mm, I guess it's a scene. It's kind of seems like a kind of loosely affiliated bunch of people with YouTube channels and things like that. They're all quite young, like they look like millennials or younger. And here you are coming in as a Gen Xer,
yeah,
and they're calling you elder, right? And
yes,
so there's a lot of elder hunger, I think, in the seekers, right? And so they want elders, elders that they can trust. They're really hungry for that. And I've thought, I've been wrestling with like, what is the role of the Gen Xer in this day and age? And I had a talk with Eric Davis about this. Like, what is our role? Because like part of our thing was like being kind of politically apathetic, kind of spiritually apathetic, a lot of apathy, and we don't see a lot of Gen X leaders in the world right now. But I think it's starting to emerge, at least in my life. My wife and I have noticed that this youngest crop of people coming up who are looking for meaning in life, who are kind of anti-establishment, they want to bring in a new paradigm. They're really intrigued by like 90s culture. I lead this youth rock band and they're like 14 to 17 years old and they're all into 90s music and fashion and just that attitude of that time. And I think like maybe our role here is to be the ones who lived back then and still carry that attitude or that style, and we can be there to be kind of living mentors or guides or examples of how to live that out, or I don't know.
yeah. I think that's probably inevitable. My focus actually in terms of subculture and counterculture goes back further.
Hmm.
And there's a specific reason why it has to do with the fact that I was born in New Zealand. Um, like I say, I was born in the late 60s, literally born during the Summer of Love. Um, Back then, before the internet, cultural waves took longer to travel around the world.
Hmm.
So I was a kid, and then I became a teenager. And like I said earlier, as a teenager, I became really interested in all of this weird subcultural, countercultural spirituality stuff. And I would read the books that had been published in the late 60s and through the 70s. So it's still quite recent. The thing was in New Zealand that cultural wave that had certainly crested and died out in the US, it was still kind of washing up on the shores of New Zealand at about the time that I was old enough to start getting into it.
Hmm.
So I kind of experienced a version of the 60s and 70s during the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
And by the 90s, of course, you're getting into the Hakim Bey and the anarchist chaos magic and that sort of thing. So
Hmm.
there's that harder edge. So it's not just hippy dippy. Um, and yeah, I mean that's what I have to offer just by virtue of the circumstances of my life. Um, and insofar as I could be considered an elder, which I'm reasonably happy to sort of at least play that role where it's useful.
Hmm.
I think that's the sort of attitude that is usefully represented now because frankly, so many kids have grown up in a culture in which the idea of the idea that everything has to be a brand, that people have to become brands. And it's just reflexive. It's not even considered that. And to me, that represents the ultimate victory of this whole corporate consumerist
Yep.
mindset that I've spent my whole life resisting. And I regret that that seems to be the default for a lot of young people today. So I guess insofar as I can be over here saying, this is another way to look at things. This is another way to do things as well. Then I'd be happy spending the rest of my life doing representing that perspective, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something about like a good elder, I think, who embodies a lot of the trickster aspect, you know, who's any time you try to brand them with something that's so highfalutin as elder, they're gonna like wriggle out of it, or they're gonna do something to sabotage that, or to kind of break that illusion, you know.
Yeah, well, it's just having seen the disaster that has been the as it were culty cult
Yeah.
phenomenon, and
But it's also not wanting to take
people
it
who
on
embrace
too
the
for
new.
your own
Well,
reasons, right?
yeah, it is. It's yeah, it's. I think that there's a phrase I've been using recently. It's something like the expert pundit guru pipeline.
Hmm.
Like I would consider myself legitimately to be an expert in a few areas that I think are of actual use and interest to people. The danger then is that that expertise just kind of bleeds out and you become a pundit and people start asking you questions about all sorts of things. I don't know. I mean, I'm an expert in these couple of areas over here. And unless I guess you have, I don't know, a strong enough ego or a small enough ego or something to be able to say, man, I don't know. That's not my sphere. That's not what I do.
Hmm.
Ask somebody else for that. The danger then is that you become a pundit. You sort of feel obliged to have an answer for everything, and then it's a very slippery slope down to guru, where all of a sudden you're trying to be in control of everything. And I would be terrible at that. God, I'd be an awful guru.
Well, think about the
I would
demands
suck at
on your
that.
time. If you felt like the need to show up and to speak to everybody who wanted to ask you questions about Israel, Hamas, or whatever it is that was outside of
Yeah,
your realm of expertise, but you still felt this like, I don't know, this the hubris to show up and like have
yeah,
an
no,
answer.
no,
Yeah, but
no,
that's part of the slacker Gen X thing, right? It's like you value your personal time and like your downtime and your
oh yeah,
time to be in your magician's laboratory exploring and playing. You don't want to be out there kind of propped up being a talking head all day
yeah,
long.
no, no. Honestly, I mean, this is pretty much. Well, I did one interview kind of along these lines a few years ago with Stephen Bradford Long. Otherwise, this is basically the first time I've spoken in any sort of, as it were, public format about a lot of this stuff.
Hmm.
And I'm not totally comfortable doing it. I respect your podcast, and so yep, I'll have a go. But I have such a strong sense of this is my sphere and no desire to be in control of anybody or venture outside that sphere in any way that could be manipulative or turn negative. As far as I'm concerned, I've got probably 20, maybe 25 years left life left. I want to spend quite a lot of it doing this sort of thing.
Hmm.
Um, I have zero interest in controlling or apocalypting or um, becoming a brand or anything like that.
Hmm.
I just don't want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why I wanted to have you on. It's like, I appreciate that, that you weren't selling yourself to me. Like I had to kind of find you through, I don't know, happenstance. And then you were almost reluctant to come on and have an open-ended conversation about stuff, like maybe even talking about
So,
yourself and your personal history and all of that. So I really respect that. Like I don't get the sense at all that you want to put yourself in the center of some new scene or movement or brand.
yeah, no, I don't. I mean, for a long time, I was aware of
But
this.
someone's got to get get the ball rolling in a way, though,
That's
right?
the thing. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
aware of this poetic faith thing happening, And I kept expecting for decades, I kept expecting like an academic or a journalist or somebody to notice that this is a thing that's happening. And they just didn't. And I'm getting older and fuck it. All right, I'll do it.
Yeah.
I'll do the best I can to do this thing because I want it to happen. I've wanted this thing to happen for so long. Um, and I'm honestly getting to the point where I'm worried that I'm going to be too old to enjoy it when it does.
Yeah.
So it's okay, screw it. I'm going to have to make it happen.
I think that's such a great motivation, and that's what's motivated me to come out of my kind of little hermit's cave here and venture out and to try out things in public is wanting to be a part of something, not finding it out there and going, well, I guess it's up to me to like step
Yeah.
up and hang up the flyer and say like we're doing this thing at this time and I'm going to be there to facilitate, but it's not all about me. It's about us kind of experimenting, co-creating, playing together.
Mm.
And that's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's something I've tried to had to find my own way to where I feel like I maintain my integrity and I'm not selling myself as some kind of leader or guru or anything like that, but just like as someone who wants to play in these kind of spaces with other people.
Yep. And I don't know. I don't know how it's going to work out for me. Um, but the people I've been interviewing for the project, they have all sorts of different takes on that.
Hmm.
Um, and it works for them. And like I say, I from the point of view of the guy who sort of tracked those folks down and edited the books and stuff, I do try to take a very open-minded approach to the ways that people are doing that. Um, Simply because I find them all interesting, often from different directions.
Hmm.
And even things like you were talking before about what's the guy's name, Marcus?
Yeah, yeah. Aubrey Marcus.
Um, yeah. Even things like that. Okay? I don't necessarily buy into his self-mythologizing and so forth. I barely know anything about him. But from what I saw in that video, there's enough there that is at least of some interest that I say, yeah, that's part of that. Those aspects can be part of this much broader roiling thing that we're starting to be able to see.
Hmm. Yeah, and maybe it's like, well, here's someone who's attempting to do this kind of thing, this alt spirituality or whatever. Um, and maybe it's an example of like when it does center around a charismatic leader who's got a lot of money to make everything slick and turns it into this kind of pyramid scheme where you buy in at a certain level and you progress
Mm.
up to another level. Like maybe it's an example of like, yeah, working within this realm, this stuff can still happen. Like capitalism can still seep in and mm, pollute the waters or something, you know?
I guess, yeah, I believe there's a part of the manifesto that addresses that.
Oh yeah, you say it pretty
Yes.
strongly.
Yeah.
Fuck all corporatized content. Fuck all branding. CultPunk is not a selfie background. Fuck, most sincerely, the bipolar mainstream monoculture.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, I love it. I love when somebody gets like polemic and, strong.
Yeah. And again, that was weird for me.
Hmm.
I've spent most of my life just not having those conversations. I'm the last person who's going to be out standing on a soapbox in a street corner yelling stuff. But I felt like the I felt like that simultaneously the novelty of a lot of the concepts required that kind of polemic, poetic language. And also, like I say, I sort of wrote the manifesto and created that website blog um, as a kind of sending up of a bat signal,
Hmm.
because this is a thing that I want to happen in the world, and the way to do that is to say, "I'm here. Are you there?"
Yeah, yeah. Um, okay, I know you're like getting increasingly comfortable talking about yourself. So I just want to, before we end, I want to touch on like you're not doing this alone, right? You work with your wife, Catherine. Um, and I've been married now for almost 20 years. We've been together for like 20 years, and it's been a really
Mm,
creative partnership. And we're always like collaborating, we're sharing ideas, we're exploring our different realms. And like last week, we did a road trip down to California and we experimented with bringing our worlds together, like music, ritual, astrology, incense making, and and it was really amazing. And I know I'm so grateful to have a partner in this continuing exploration and development of a creative, meaningful life. Talk to me a little bit about how you guys found each other and what part that the partnership has played in your life.
Oh, we found each other. It's sort of a romantic story, I guess. I was in Chicago. I was teaching a stage combat workshop. I was trying. I guess I flew in from, I can't even remember, New Zealand probably, as part of a tour. Like I said, I used to travel around a lot teaching. Kat at that time, and still is, part of a wonderful all-female sort of stage combat focused theatre company called the Babes with Blades. And Babes with Blades and I think another Chicago stage combat company brought me in to teach a workshop. And so that was just what I was doing. So I came in and doing the thing in the space. And about halfway through, we were taking a break. And I mentioned that I'd never been in Chicago before, really had no concept of the city. All I knew was like airport and the route into this sort of gymnasium. And this young lady said, "Oh, while you're here, you should see some of the city at least. I'll show you the roof." And I found myself climbing on this rickety ancient Chicago sort of warehouse building, fire escape. Yeah, up behind this young lady and sort of looking out over the Chicago skyline. And that young lady turned out to be Kat. And we got on really well and did the long distance relationship thing for a couple of years, and then we were like, the hell with it, we should get married, and so we did. And she lived in New Zealand for a couple of years, and then we moved to Chicago. And the collaboration, well, like at this upcoming event, Kat's one of Kat's specialties as a performing artist is voice,
Mm.
and so it's like voice and breath work. And she's a singer, and she's taught voice to actors and that sort of thing. So at the moment, we're working on it's a thing it's sort of an elaboration and a specialization of some things that we've been doing for a long time. But it will be in the context of the mystery school, and this will be about the only specific thing I want to talk about because it's a mystery school and we want it to be mysterious. But there will be morning warm-up sessions, which will be the group, and it's only a group of 12 people. We'll gather and we will do this kind of symbolic movement meditation, which will also include elements of breath and voice. And we'll kind of co-teach some things. I might take the lead in some of the movement stuff. Kat will take the lead in some of the voice and breath work. And this will be a collaborative exercise that we're very, very keen to tie into the philosophical and artistic themes of the rest of the event. So it's not just sort of a yoga type stretching thing in the morning, but it's absolutely integrated into the bigger picture stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's the plan, and we will hopefully, I'll be able to get back to you, and when we get back from Vermont in a month and a half or so,
We'll
and
do the
say yes, it was all this
post-mortem and see
wonderful,
how it
wonderful
went.
success. Yeah.
That's great. And when the anthology comes out, I definitely am going to want to talk to you again. And gosh, man, I'd love to make it out for this mystery school. It's like it's so up my alley, and I'm so kind of
Mm.
thirsty for it at this moment.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like I say, if it's a success, then I would be delighted to keep on doing these things. At some point, I will have to stop doing it for free because
Yeah.
this is actually costing us quite a lot of money, this first one. But
You got to at least break even, man.
yeah, no, not for this one. But it's an act of faith, basically. It
Yeah.
is, we'll do this. If it works as well as we think that it will, then we'll elaborate it. Maybe it can start to move around, but yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. Well, and that's a good example of this different idea of faith, right? It's like faith that what? That I'm gonna like learn something through this process, that the process itself, which is unknown, is gonna have some meaningful outcome, which I can't foresee from where I am right here. And so that's that kind of active faith, I think, that we were talking about at the very beginning of this chat.
Yeah, yeah. And it's having that faith and being willing to act on it, taking it seriously enough to be willing to act on it. And in this instance that we're talking about at the moment, being willing to spend money and to spend time and to travel a long distance in the hope, and the real hope that it's going to be something genuinely meaningful and magical.
Yeah. Well, we come back to our old pal, the
Yeah.
fool.
Hey, buddy.
I love this card because it tells me so much about how to be a fool. But one of the things I get from the card, he's got his little bindle on his shoulder, right? And in this old Marseille deck, which to me is like the true tarot, his stick that he's got his bindle on is actually a spoon. So there's something about traveling lightly, taking only what is absolutely needed, which allows you kind of more adaptability, more flexibility, more options. Um, if you got a stick, make sure it doubles as like a spoon as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. That's pure Gen X pragmatism right there. It's DIY.
Totally. Well, Tony, man, this has been such a great chat, and I'm so happy to meet you and hear about this work. It gives me hope that I'm not the only one who wants to play in this area and find a third way forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll keep in touch. The book's coming out in 3 volumes. It was originally going to be 1 volume, but we crunched the numbers and that would have been a 670 something page book. So
Unwieldy, yeah.
yeah, yes. So no, my editor persuaded me to do it in 3. And the mystery school is the beginning, maybe is the beginning of something. So yeah, we'll keep in touch, and I bet we'll run into each other one way or the other.
Cool. And if people want to find out more, there's a link to your blog in the description below. And also check out the morbid anatomy courses. I think they've been archived and you can still purchase and download them.
I know that they're archived. Yeah, I think if you're a member of Morbid Anatomy, then you should be able to see those. The Art of Ritual course. And yeah, I don't do very much by way of social media, but germane to this discussion would be altdeath.com, alt-death, and cultpunk.art.
Yeah.
And between those two, that alt death is sort of my more personal specialty. Cult punk is all the poetic faith and that side of things.
Yeah, cool. And there's tons of rabbit holes that you can get
Yeah.
drawn into on those sites. So right on, man. We'll take care and we'll see you on the other side.